Your morbid curiosity got the best of you, didn't it? Alright, well here's even more evil human experiments. Part 3! Usually when you think of World War II, chemical weapons are not the first thing that comes to mind, and that's because almost everyone learned their lesson in World War I. Except Japan, of course, who used them heavily against China. But they would learn 2 big lessons later on. But on the Western front, chemical weapons were rarely used for fear of heavy retaliation. However, precautionary measures still had to be taken in the event that they were used. In order to design effective protective equipment, one has to learn what they're dealing with. Enter the mustard gas experiments, secret tests conducted by the United States to gain more insight into the effects of mustard gas on soldiers. Now you might be asking, what about all those soldiers killed during World War I? Well, you'd actually be surprised to learn that out of the estimated 17 million or so deaths attributed to the Great War, only about 90,000 were from chemical weapons, with only a few thousand being directly from mustard gas. And that's only about 1/100%. That's not really a conclusive sample size. In order to paint a clearer picture of what they were dealing with, over 60,000 soldiers were voluntold to participate in these trials, often with zero knowledge of what they were about to experience. In total, there were 3 experimental designs for troops to partake in. The first, and the easiest, was the patch test. Liquid mustard gas was applied directly to the test subject's skin in order to observe any immediate effects. The second was the field test, where soldiers were deployed on a simulated battlefield and enveloped in a mustard gas cloud to test various protective equipment prototypes. The last design was the chamber test. Equipped with only makeshift gas masks, soldiers were locked in small chambers where mustard gas was piped in order to test its incapacitative properties. One soldier, Sergeant Rollins Edwards, recalls his horrific experience when enduring a chamber test at just 21 years old in 1943.
And it was just one little hut there. And they told us all to go in there, but don't put on your gas mask until you smell gas. And we all went in there, and I heard when the latch closed, it had a bar outside the door. This was plywood. And we all standing up in there, but I put my gas mask on right then. Well, the gas mask then was just paper and charcoal. When they turned that gas on from up top there, this guy started to scream because it was feel like there was a million red ants over you, just all over your whole complete body.
Keep in mind that mustard gas itself, while it can be lethal, had a very low mortality rate in World War I, only around 2 to 3%. Its main purpose was to incapacitate rather than kill, and it was great at its job. But it was the British who decided to kick things up a notch with lewisite, a deadlier alternative to mustard gas. This was an arsenic-based compound capable of damaging your DNA on contact. Skin would blister, and your respiratory system would likely fail. But not only were these experiments aimed at observing the health effects on soldiers as a whole, but also how the chemicals may have affected different races. Black, Puerto Rican, Japanese, and white soldiers were tested separately, with the white soldiers being the control group, meaning that they were the baseline to compare to. If there was enough evidence to suggest that one group was more resistant than another, well, guess who's going to be sent on the front line? Of course, in the end, no such conclusive evidence was ever found, so good job with that one. Any soldier resisting participation was threatened with dishonorable discharge and jail time for failure to obey commands. During these experiments, soldiers were subjected to agonizing pain and trauma, which resulted in permanent physical and psychological damage for the rest of their lives. These men were scarred with chemical burns on their skin, their eyes, and even in their lungs. Those who endured these experiments as well as survived any future combat, because these soldiers were still expected to fight in the war, were unable to seek any medical attention once discharged from service. They were sworn to secrecy, lest they face legal backlash for disclosing information about a confidential operation. While you might be sitting there waving your finger at the United States, know that it wasn't just the wonderful freedom powerhouse who did this kind of stuff. The mustard gas experiments actually took place years after the good old redcoats did the same thing in Australia, England, Canada, and India, which is probably when the British developed their aversion to anything remotely spicy. Now here's a topic that'll probably get me canceled. Way back in the day in 1965, 2 twin baby boys slopped out of their mother. Bruce and Brian Reimer. As cute as they were, they had a bit of a problem. Both boys were born with phimosis, an odd medical condition that, in monetizable terms, meant that they had trouble peeing properly due to a non-retractable skin on their little fellas. Well, that's not the worst. I mean, just a simple circumcision would pop those turtles right out of their shell, right? Normally, yes, if you have a decent doctor. A description apparently not befitting of Bruce's doctor. The physician who performed this rather routine surgery decided to be a bit unconventional and cauterize the freshly cut skin rather than a traditional stitching. This deviation from standard procedure rendered Bruce's manhood completely non-functional at just 8 months old. Outraged, the Reimer parents refused to have Brian undergo the same treatment, so his jacket still had its hood. With Bruce's medically malpracticed member, Reimer's parents eventually found one Dr. John Money, which sounds more like the prim and proper version of Johnny Cash, except Money would be performing a lot more hurt. Dr. John Money was a medical psychology professor at Johns Hopkins University. His research centered on theories of gender identity and gender roles. He would eventually pioneer the process of chemical castration, a drug treatment on sex offenders to completely eliminate their violent desires, which is pretty cool. But what's not cool is his role in the life of Bruce Reimer. After the Reimer family got in contact with Dr. Money, they were advised to have Bruce's remaining male parts surgically removed and to swap teams, undergoing gender reassignment and instead being raised as a girl. Bewildered, the parents agreed, and at just 2 years old, Bruce Reimer became Brenda Reimer. Although later in life, Bruce stated that he never really identified as female. But Dr. Money didn't stop there. He pushed further and tried to upsell just beyond the base model. Looks like little Brenda's gonna need some hormone treatment, and while you're at it, I can throw in a vagina as well. It'll look like a chewed up wad of gum, but it'll do the trick. We're just gonna take the hormone treatment? Thanks. No one ever wants the vagina. But this is where things started to really take a turn. You see, Money had a theory, one that explored the influences of nature versus nurture as it pertains to gender identity. He believed that such identities are instilled upon us through our upbringing rather than our biological traits. And this would culminate into one of the most strange and disturbing experiments I've ever read about. So thanks, YouTube comments section. Appreciate that. In what I can only assume would be a way to further his research, both Brenda and Brian regularly visited Dr. Money for routine checkups to see how the change had impacted their relationship and well-being. At just 6 years old, Money began exposing the children to explicit adult content. Even worse, he reportedly forced the two children to reenact certain poses featured in these films and had, at least on one occasion, taken pictures of the children doing this. Both children had reported incidents of Dr. Money's temper when resisting such requests. They stated that although he was calm and well-mannered in the presence of their parents, he became violent and verbally abusive behind closed doors. When discussing the events years later, Brenda recalled one specific event where Dr. Money had yelled at him for refusing to undress when both children were forced to inspect each other. Years later, a now teenage Brenda was propositioned by Money to undergo a full transition surgery, but Brenda repeatedly and adamantly refused. After years of, let's not sugarcoat it, full-blown sexual abuse, Brenda hit a psychological breaking point. It was at this time that the Reimer parents broke the truth to Brenda that he was born as a boy. And immediately, Brenda abandoned life as a girl, took on the name David, and even underwent reconstructive surgeries to restore damage done to him. Dr. Money, however, fraudulently reported his work as a successful female gender development, using it as evidence to support future gender reassignment cases. But in 1997, David came forward with his story to discredit Dr. Money, speaking to the horrors of his upbringing and the mental toll it took on both him and his brother. David's testimony was published across several high-profile magazines, but as freeing as it was to tell his story, it wasn't enough to free him from his mental anguish. In 2004, David had taken his own life at age 38, just 2 years after his brother, Brian, had overdosed on antidepressants. Dr. Money had brushed off David's testimony as merely right-wing and anti-feminist propaganda. According to the Intersex Society of North America, however, many individuals within the intersex community had condemned Money for falsifying his report, as it had led to thousands of surgical procedures done on infants as a matter of policy. Over the following years, Money would continue to have many of his theories debunked by his own social experiments. He never faced any consequences for his explicit actions with the Reimer twins or any other families that he had impacted with his practices. John Money ultimately cashed out of this mortal coil in 2006 at the age of 85. As an added kick to the butchered dick, even though Brian never had the surgery to cure his phimosis, that condition that kickstarted this whole thing, it eventually corrected itself with age. So it is likely that Bruce would have also outgrown this condition, sparing both brothers from their cruel fate. But hey, hindsight's 20/20. It's not real. During the complete shit stain on South African history that was apartheid, there was an infectious disease running rampant through the South American military. Or at least it was thought of as a disease by some. And just like any other disease, there had to be a cure, right? Well, that's what Dr. Aubrey Levin claimed anyway. In 1967, the South African military began forced conscription of soldiers to beef up the military. Initially, homosexuality was outright banned in the military, so when joining, soldiers were examined by medical doctors to screen for any suspicious tendencies.
Why are you gay?
Any enlisted soldiers found to be lying about being straight were severely punished with imprisonment, but in reality, there was a strong concern over the opposite. It was actually feared that many men would lie about their preferences in order to avoid being conscripted. So how goes the conscription? Not good. Apparently everyone around here is gay. What? That's impossible. Is it? So instead, the rules were changed to allow those identifying as homosexual to be forced into military service. They just had to be cured is all. So those individuals were sent to a secret military hospital to unwillingly partake in Dr. Levin's many cures. This is where the Aversion Project began. Soldiers, which now found themselves amongst a population of drug addicts and the severely mentally ill, were strapped into chairs and forced to watch many explicit adult films of the he on him variety. Nice. These patients sustained aggressive electrical shocks while viewing the films, up to 120 volts and about 800 milliamps, which is super painful and potentially lethal. The theory was that if repeatedly shocked, the brain would eventually rewire itself to anticipate pain when thinking of the naughty dude thoughts. A Clockwork Orange style. The tests continued, but Levin failed to get any of the results that he had anticipated. In response, he upped the ante by continuing the aggressive shock therapy in conjunction with deep-throating depressant drugs to make the victims' brains more susceptible to change. Despite this outright torture, the desired effects were never achieved, and no cure had occurred. Although it does have to be said that some soldiers simply faked that they were cured in order to escape these torturous experiments. As a last-ditch effort to stop any of these so-called unnatural desires from ever occurring again, Levin had these soldiers chemically castrated against their will before being released from the hospital. Now, tragically, this took a huge psychological and physical toll on the victims, and many ended up taking their own lives shortly after release. Dr. Levin went back to the drawing board and came up with one more attempt at a cure: forced gender reassignment. You see, if you like dudes and you're a dude, well, that's just silly, but if you're now a girl and you still like dudes, then it's a-okay. Several soldiers were forced to undergo the surgery, and not many survived. Those who did suffered extreme medical issues for the rest of their lives. Survivors were given new identities and forbidden from contacting anyone from their old life. But the horror didn't stop there. In order to keep his failed experiments out of the public light, Dr. Levin oversaw the construction of Greifswald, a forced labor camp where any of his subjects that were considered incurable would reside. It wasn't until 1975, 7 years after his initial tests began, that the nightmare finally ended after Dr. Levin received a promotion. He left the military to become the Director of Mental Health for the South African Department of Health Services and Welfare. Of course, justice would never be served. After apartheid ended in 1995, Levin fled to Canada where he lived comfortably as a psychology professor. He was charged in an unrelated crime in 2010 and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, but he was ultimately released just 18 months later on parole. And as of this video, he is 86 years old and still alive today as a free man. In the midst of the Cold War, rumors began to spread across the continents of Soviet brainwashing. American prisoners of war released after the Korean War were witnessed to be shadows of the men they once were, often regurgitating communist ideals to which they were apparently subjected to repeatedly during their capture. Some other men outright refused to return to American soil and fully defected to the USSR. Traitors. But these obvious tells of psychological manipulation struck fear into the vacuous heart of the American government. The CIA director at the time, Allen Dulles, condemned such actions, calling out the communist brainwashing as abhorrent and nefarious. He went on to state how such war tactics were beneath American values and even human values as a whole. So in order to ensure that this would never happen on American soil, Director Dulles, just 3 days after his little speech, approved Project MKUltra, the United States' very own mind control experimentation program. Sure, Dulles may have said that mind control is un-American, but losing is even un-American-er. The main goal of MKUltra was to develop ways to control human behavior and ultimately develop a truth serum, be it a physical substance or a specific technique. This would be especially helpful with things like espionage or interrogating enemy prisoners of war. Hey, it's only evil if the enemy does it. MKUltra was composed of several different methods for perfecting the art of psychological manipulation. These included hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and administering experimental drugs, the most pervasive of which being the forced administration of LSD. Now, these tactics were not limited to just prisoners of war. Those are way too scarce in numbers. In order to get more promising and conclusive data, you need a larger population. Well, that's nothing a few prisons, psych wards, and the US Army can't supply. Wait, what? The head honcho of MKUltra was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, one of the CIA's top biochemists. Under his guidance, and with generous funding from the CIA, experiments began across North America in over 30 institutions and universities, including Columbia University and Stanford University. Experiments were later expanded to Canada too, but let's start domestically. MKUltra was set in motion in 1953, where the first candidate for this mythical truth serum was tested: lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, a powerful synthetic hallucinogen developed in 1938 in Switzerland. I originally wanted to develop a new respiratory stimulant, and I did, but now I can also taste colors. That's pretty cool too. Tons of this stuff was purchased by the CIA for use in MKUltra, roughly $4.2 million worth in today's money. In true evil experiment fashion, test subjects were never given explicit knowledge of what they were about to experience, only that they would be participating in some sort of test. And these subjects were either convicted criminals or mentally ill patients who either had no choice in participation or the ability to comprehend what they were about to go through. Former organized crime boss guy Whitey Bulger was one such patient, and he wrote about his experience as a government lab rat in 1957. He recalled being injected with what he later found out to be LSD. Here's an excerpt from his writings. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. Total loss of appetite. Hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning into skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. Yeah, it was really rough stuff, and maybe some people in the audience can attest to some experience like this. Let me know in the comments if Bulger's testimony sounds something like you've gone through. You little deviants, you. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the appropriately named Operation Midnight Climax. This was a rather risque covert operation where several CIA-funded women of the night would lure unsuspecting and rather anxious men into CIA safe houses across California and New York. These men, unfortunately, would only have their minds blown as they were well supplied with drinks laced with LSD. CIA agents would observe these festivities from behind a two-way mirror as these dudes absolutely lost their goddamn minds. Athletic little fella, isn't he? You think that's bad? Well, the Canadians weren't much better. Dr. Donald Cameron developed the concept of psychic driving, a nightmarish experiment aimed at erasing memories and reprogramming the human brain. In addition to the usual LSD administration, Dr. Cameron also performed intense electroshock therapy, often at 30 to 40 times the normal power. Patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks on end and forced to listen to looping audio clips. These patients were often diagnosed with anxiety disorders and postpartum depression. So imagine coming into a hospital, having anxiety, and being strapped into a chair, injected with drugs, electrically shocked, and forced to listen to the same audio looping for weeks on end. Needless to say, these victims suffered permanent physiological damage, including complete amnesia and losing the ability to speak. Project MKUltra came to an abrupt end in 1973 when all of the classified documents were ordered to be destroyed after government-wide panic began following the events of the Watergate incident. You know, when President Nixon's re-election campaign staff were found secretly spying on their political opponents. This sparked a huge public distrust of the government and was a catalyst for many investigations of the government for foul play. Despite the purge of documentation, over 20,000 documents survived, which were subsequently investigated and brought into the public eye a year later. In 1976, President Ford signed an executive order banning any drug experimentation on human subjects without written and witness-informed consent. Dr. Gottlieb, who conveniently retired from the CIA in 1973, faced no consequences for his role in MKUltra and ultimately brushed off the project as ineffective and a waste of time. He died peacefully in his home in 1999. Well, that was pretty neat. If you enjoyed this video, remember to do the thing and the stuff. And if you want to learn more about human experiments, be sure to check out part 1 here and part 2 here. I'll see you over there.